I was 36 when I realized loyalty could be the most dangerous thing you give away. For 12 years, I poured everything into building Walter Crane's construction company from a struggling three-man operation into one of Colorado's most trusted names in commercial development. As chief structural engineer, I was the one clients asked for by name, the one standing on frozen job sites at dawn, ensuring every beam could carry twice its load. Everything shattered on a Tuesday morning in March. At 11 a.m., I got a call. Stress fractures were spreading through the main support columns of the Riverbend Plaza parking structure. When I arrived, my stomach dropped. The cracks weren't surface level. They spiderwebbed deep into pillars meant to hold 4 levels of vehicles. The month-long investigation pointed squarely to the concrete supplier who diluted cement ratios to boost margins. I'd flagged their quality control 3 months earlier, but budget pressure buried my warnings in ignored email chains. At the emergency board meeting, none of that mattered. They needed a scapegoat, and my name was on every approval document. Walter Crane sat silently as they dismantled my career. The company didn't collapse outright, but lawsuits and insurance claims cost 20 people their jobs within weeks. Overnight, I went from respected engineer to industry cautionary tale. Colleagues stopped returning my calls. My wife, Claire, tried to be supportive, but the strain became unbearable. "I can't live with someone who brings this much stress home," she said. She filed for divorce 2 months later. Our son, Owen, was 6. He didn't understand why I suddenly lived elsewhere, or why Mom's eyes were always red. Every weekend pickup, he'd ask, "Are you coming home soon?" I never knew how to explain that some breaks can't be fixed. If this is your first time here, hit subscribe so you never miss another powerful story. And let me know your thoughts on today's one in the comments. I read every message. The next few months felt like drowning in slow motion. I sent out over 60 applications, 3 interviews, all ended the same. Polite praise, then the Riverbend mention, followed by wary silence. One hiring manager told me outright I'd make clients nervous. I sold my car, moved to a cheaper apartment, and wondered if I should vanish to a state where no one knew the name Calvin Northwood. Then, in late August, an unknown number rang. "Garrett Sullivan, Sullivan Construction. I know what happened at Riverbend, and it wasn't your fault." Months of rejection had made me skeptical, but he kept talking. "I'm moving into commercial work. I need someone who knows structures from foundation to finish, someone who's been in the field, not just behind a desk." He asked me to meet in Fort Collins. I hesitated, thinking of Owen, the bills, the thinning hope, but drove there the next morning. Sullivan's office felt more like a warehouse than a corporate suite. Garrett shook my hand with the grip of a man who'd spent decades on job sites and looked at me like he already knew my answer. He didn't ask me to defend myself. Just one question. "Do you still trust yourself as an engineer?" When I paused, he said, "A man who's been knocked down and gets back up is worth more than someone who's never fallen." That 30-minute conversation was the first time in half a year someone saw capability, not liability. On the drive home, I thought of Owen and whether I could show him setbacks don't have to be permanent. I called Garrett that night and accepted. I started without authority. Garrett wanted me to rebuild trust from the ground up. My first task, review old files and update safety protocols. I saw it as a test, not a demotion. Within weeks, I saw the gaps, handwritten logs, inconsistent records. In Colorado's freeze-thaw cycles, skipping one curing step in winter could cause spring failures. So I overhauled their entire quality system, temperature monitoring for cold pours, rebar checklists, stricter supplier vetting. Garrett studied my report, nodded once, and said nothing. That quiet approval was all I needed. Results followed fast. Winter cracking stopped. Inspections improved. Timelines stabilized because crews weren't fixing preventable errors. Site supervisors, once wary of my past, started seeking me out when things went wrong. I showed up early, stood in sub-zero temps, checked every detail. Title or not, I became essential. Owen was 7 by then. On weekends, I'd sometimes bring him to sites. He loved watching excavators and asking why foundations ran so deep. He'd draw cranes and buildings. I taped them to my wall. Some days I was exhausted, but his smile made it worth it. 18 months in, Sullivan Construction began landing bigger projects. Our reputation spread to Denver and Boulder. A Wyoming developer invited us to bid on a commercial complex. Garrett sent me to lead the assessment. Standing on that wind-swept plain, I designed a plan for high winds, expansive clay, and wild temperature swings. The developer was impressed. We won the contract. When we finished ahead of schedule, with zero structural issues and foundation tolerances exceeding state requirements, it put us on the map. Soon, clients across the Mountain West were calling. Through it all, Garrett never treated me like I needed supervision. He gave me full technical authority and backed my decisions without hesitation. Without him, I might never have recovered from Riverbend. Whenever I presented a plan, he'd ask one question: "You confident in this?" If I nodded, he signed off immediately. Sullivan Construction grew from 8 employees to nearly 50. New hires were told I handled all technical decisions. Some joked the company had 2 pillars: Garrett, who kept the money right, and me, who kept the structure standing. It felt strange, but also real. Like I'd finally rebuilt something solid. One afternoon, Garrett introduced me to a major client by saying, "Calvin's the reason everything we build stays standing." He said it simply, but it reignited a confidence I thought Riverbend had destroyed forever. I rebuilt my reputation not with words, but with straight foundations, stable structures, and safety-first decisions. Those 11 years weren't easy, but step by step, I felt whole again. I believed I'd built something that couldn't be taken away. I was wrong. I never anticipated the return of Ethan Sullivan. That morning, while supervising formwork outside Boulder, Garrett called me back to the office. In the conference room sat a young man, expensive watch glinting, spinning a pen like a toy. Ethan, 29, fresh off an MBA in California, radiating the confidence of someone who'd never truly struggled. His handshake was firm but dismissive. His eyes scanned the room like he was already redesigning it. Garrett introduced me as the chief engineer who'd built the company's technical reputation. Ethan smiled politely, but I saw the calculation behind it. That same afternoon, he interrupted my project meeting, insisting we compress the concrete curing schedule despite Colorado's volatile temperatures. When I explained we needed 3 weeks for proper strength testing, he shrugged. West Coast firms are far more efficient. I looked to Garrett for support. He only smiled and told me to consider Ethan's input. Ethan wasn't just overconfident, he was dangerously inexperienced, convinced business models could replace field judgment, and Garrett watched him with a hope I'd never seen before, the look of a man who'd found his heir. By week 2, Ethan was everywhere, showing up on sites in leather shoes that had never touched dirt, preaching growth, branding, and market share, never once asking about rebar spacing or slump tests. One supervisor whispered he acted like he was performing a role, not learning the work. Soon his ideas took root. Discount packages that cut safety margins, timelines halved to reward boldness. When I argued construction wasn't software, that you can't shortcut physics, he laughed and asked if I was afraid of innovation. The culture shifted. Younger staff admired his swagger. Seniors grew uneasy. Leonard Hayes, our most seasoned supervisor, pulled me aside. "Ethan's like a wildfire. Impressive from a distance, devastating up close." I tried to stay calm, but it was clear. My position was being quietly undermined. Ethan never challenged me outright, just watched with silent judgment as if my decade of hard-won expertise was obsolete. Then came the moment I dreaded. While reviewing Cheyenne drawings, Garrett walked in and said, "I want Ethan to learn from you. Mentor him like I once mentored you." I said nothing, but I understood. This wasn't about training. It was succession. And Garrett had already chosen. Ability be damned. For the first time in years, my foundation trembled, not from self-doubt, but because I could see the storm coming. The place where I'd rebuilt my life was about to be torn apart, and I didn't have to wait long. Ethan began dismantling the systems I'd spent 11 years building. Overnight, he swapped our project software for a cheap alternative with no quality tracking, no temperature logs, no inspection storage. When I confronted him, he said we needed to optimize expenses. I reminded him Colorado wasn't California. He called me outdated. Days later, he axed our top-tier concrete supplier, replacing them with an uncertified budget vendor offering 30% lower prices. Quality isn't negotiable, I said. He accused me of clinging to the past. Chaos followed. New suppliers skipped pre-pour checks. Ethan pressured junior engineers to bypass soil testing. I ordered work, stopped, only for him to override me, desperate to prove his methods worked. This wasn't disagreement anymore. It was recklessness disguised as progress. And what cut deepest? Watching Leonard Hayes shift sides, the man who'd stood beside me through sub-zero winters, verifying every inch of rebar, now nodding along with Ethan's promises. But now he sat in meetings nodding along with Ethan, calling his proposals necessary evolution. Ethan had promised Leonard a senior management position if his changes succeeded. I saw hesitation in Leonard's eyes, but ultimately, he chose Ethan's side. As things deteriorated, I went to Garrett. I laid out everything: the inadequate software, the unlicensed suppliers, the pressure on engineers to cut corners. Garrett listened, but his expression had changed. He said I was worrying too much, that Ethan needed room to fail so he could learn. I told him mistakes in construction weren't just spreadsheet errors. They meant cracked foundations, structural failures, or accidents we could never undo. But Garrett looked at me as if I were resisting progress. He said I was being too rigid and needed to embrace change. I walked out feeling like I'd lost something irreplaceable. Not just Garrett's trust, but the position I'd spent years building. I began understanding that Ethan wasn't a passing problem. He was the person Garrett had placed all his faith in, regardless of competence. The breaking point came during a meeting with a major client from Las Vegas. I was presenting our safety-focused construction plan for a commercial plaza when Ethan suddenly stood up and cut me off mid-sentence. He told the entire room my proposals were slow and outdated. He said I was afraid of challenges, afraid of change, and that Sullivan Construction needed bolder strategies to compete regionally. The room went silent. I looked at Garrett, waiting for him to intervene. He did nothing. He only glanced at Ethan and gave a small nod, as if agreeing with every word. That moment cut deeper than anything else. I'd rebuilt this company after Riverbend destroyed my career, and now Garrett was letting his son humiliate me in front of clients. When the meeting ended, the client said they needed to reconsider, because the company seemed disorganized internally. That was my worst fear realized. Not just safety at risk, but the reputation I'd fought to protect crumbling again. That night, driving home, Owen asked if work was okay. I smiled so he wouldn't worry. But inside, one question kept echoing. Did Garrett still see me as essential, or was I just temporary scaffolding for Ethan's ascent? That question felt like a crack spreading deeper every day, and I didn't know if anything I'd built could withstand what was coming. After the Las Vegas meeting, I started noticing Ethan's quiet maneuvering behind the scenes. He held private meetings with Garrett, carrying colorful reports filled with optimistic projections that only someone who'd never supervised real construction would believe. I glimpsed a few drafts left on the printer. Every number was inflated beyond reason. Productivity doubled, timelines cut in half, profit margins rising 35%. These weren't realistic plans. They were fantasies. Leonard continued supporting Ethan in every meeting, praising his vision and saying the company needed fresh thinking. He avoided my eyes whenever I questioned the data. Part of me wanted to believe he was under pressure, but eventually I accepted reality. Leonard had chosen his side. One morning, Garrett called everyone into the main conference room. When I walked in, Ethan stood beside him with his hand resting on a chair as if it already belonged to him. On the screen were slides full of aggressive goals I'd never seen in any technical meeting. Garrett stood and announced that Sullivan Construction was ready for major expansion. Then, he said the words I'd been dreading. Ethan would become the new chief executive, and I would transition into administrative support and technical documentation. He said it as if it were logical progression, like replacing an old machine with something newer. I heard someone gasp behind me, but all I felt was coldness spreading through my chest. I asked Garrett if he actually believed the numbers Ethan was pushing. Ethan stepped forward before Garrett could answer. He said I shouldn't create tension, that I was a good engineer. But times had changed, and the company needed modern business thinking. I said nothing. I wanted to ask what I'd done wrong after 11 years of carrying this company through every storm. But when I saw Garrett's eyes fixed on Ethan, I understood the answer. When the meeting ended, people dispersed with uncomfortable expressions. Some younger staff looked at me sympathetically. The older employees stayed silent. Ethan walked up close and murmured just loud enough for me to hear. "You should learn from the new generation." His tone felt like the final cut. I didn't return to my desk. I went straight to Garrett's office. I told him I couldn't do paperwork after spending my career on job sites. Garrett sighed and said he needed to balance experience with innovation. He told me not to take it personally, then placed a hand on my shoulder the way you console someone being demoted. I listened, but the sincerity was gone. Garrett no longer saw me as foundational. He saw me as the shadow clearing Ethan's path. I walked back to my desk, opened my laptop, and typed my resignation. I refused to let Ethan think I'd sit quietly as decoration. When I walked outside, I handed the letter to our office manager, Patricia. She froze, then pulled me into a tight hug. Leonard stood nearby, eyes red, unable to speak. Their embraces only deepened the ache. I was leaving because of betrayal, but I was also abandoning people who'd stood beside me for years. As I reached my truck, I saw Owen waiting in the visitor area. Garrett's assistant had picked him, up from school since I'd expected to be in meetings all day. Owen ran toward me and wrapped his arms around my waist. He looked up with worry covering his face. "Dad, did you get fired because of me? I don't want you to be sad anymore." I held him close, feeling everything from that day press into that moment. I told him it wasn't his fault, that adults sometimes make unfair decisions, but we have to remember our own worth. I said it to comfort him, but I was also reminding myself. When I closed the truck door and looked back at the building where I'd rebuilt my life, I understood Sullivan Construction was no longer mine. I walked away, not because I was weak, but because I deserved a place where dedication wasn't expected to be replaced. That day, I left with a heavy heart, but my head high, and I had no way of knowing that within weeks, that decision would become the most important one of my life. I left Sullivan Construction without any clear plan. The years I spent there had become such a major part of my identity that losing my role left me standing at a crossroads with no clear direction. In the days after I resigned, I drove Owen to school, then came home and sat in front of my laptop, opening job listings repeatedly without being able to click submit. I didn't want to return to entry-level positions, but I wasn't sure I had the strength to start from nothing again. A week later, I received a call from an unfamiliar number. The woman introduced herself as Diane Porter. I recognized the name instantly. She was a prominent real estate investor in Denver, someone who'd partnered with Sullivan Construction on several major projects. She asked to meet at a quiet coffee shop downtown. When I arrived, Diane was already there, wearing a professional blazer, her gray hair cut short, her eyes sharp but kind. After brief pleasantries, she looked directly at me. "I know what happened at Sullivan Construction, and I know the only reason that company succeeded was because of you, not Garrett, and certainly not Ethan." I stayed quiet. Maybe I'd been waiting for someone to say those words, but hearing them felt unexpectedly difficult. She placed a folder on the table. "I'm expanding into light industrial construction. I need someone trustworthy to ensure no project ever sacrifices safety for profit. I want you to lead a new company. I'll invest, you'll manage, full operational control, no interference." I exhaled slowly. I once led the technical side of a company and watched it collapse with my name attached. I know what failure feels like, and I don't want to relive it, especially with Owen depending on me. Diane tilted her head slightly. "One mistake didn't define your career. If you let fear make your decisions, you'll repeat the same cycle." Then she said something that hit hard. "Your son deserves to see you rise, not retreat." That sentence struck exactly where I was most vulnerable. Owen had absorbed too much the past few years. The collapse at my old firm, the divorce, the pressure of watching his father struggle to stay standing. I didn't want him growing up believing injustice could permanently break a person. I asked Diane for a few days to think. I barely slept during that time. I was afraid of failing again, afraid of trusting the wrong people, afraid of watching everything slip away like before. But somewhere inside that fear, a small spark returned, the chance to build something where I controlled every standard, every process, every person on the team. A place where no one could tear me down to make room for someone else. Finally, I called Diane and told her I'd do it. The signing happened in her attorney's office. Nothing extravagant, just formal and serious. And just like that, Northwood Structural Solutions was born. On the first day, it was only me in a small 2-room office with a used desk. But when I looked at the new nameplate on the door, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Possibility. 2 days later, Leonard Hayes showed up. He stood outside holding his hard hat. When I opened the door, he said nothing at first, just held out his resume. I asked if he was sure. He said he'd seen enough of what Ethan was doing. He wanted to work somewhere buildings weren't treated like experiments. I hired him immediately. Not long after, a young engineer named Stephanie, who I'd mentored, sent an email asking to join. She wrote that she'd left Sullivan Construction because she refused to stay where safety was treated like an obstacle. Reading her message, my throat tightened. Someone still saw what I'd been fighting for. That's how Northwood Structural Solutions began. Small, but filled with purpose. Owen was thrilled when I told him I had my own company. He told his teacher, then drew his version of our logo. In the afternoons after school, he'd sit in the corner coloring while I worked, occasionally asking innocent questions that dissolved all the pressure. Watching him smile, I knew I was on the right path. The company grew faster than expected. Diane referred several clients, and after 2 early projects, positive feedback spread regionally. Former colleagues from Sullivan Construction began calling, asking if I was hiring. Everything unfolded naturally, as if all I needed to do was build the right place and the right people would come. Looking back at the chaos I endured at Sullivan Construction, I finally understood something clearly. Sometimes the collapse of one door isn't an ending. It's the force pushing you toward the one that was always meant for you. Northwood Structural Solutions wasn't a massive empire, but to me it was the strongest foundation I'd ever built. And this time, no one could break it unless I allowed it. News of my new company reached Sullivan Construction faster than I expected. Within days, I received a message from a former employee. Ethan is furious. I wasn't surprised. Ethan had treated his position at Sullivan Construction like an inherited crown, and my departure created a comparison he never wanted to face. His retaliation started with rumors. One morning, Leonard walked into my office looking irritated. He said Ethan was spreading claims that I'd stolen proprietary data before leaving, including contractor lists, design files, and client records. I laughed because the accusation was absurd, but Leonard didn't laugh. He said several contractors had called, worried they might face legal trouble if they continued working with Northwood Structural Solutions. A few days later, a major subcontractor told me Ethan had contacted them directly, warning that Sullivan Construction would terminate their contracts if they collaborated with me. Some firms depended on long-term work, with Sullivan Construction had no choice but to hesitate. I didn't blame them. I simply noted the reality I'd have to push through. Ethan didn't stop there. He began submitting bids so low they were nearly impossible to fulfill. I recognized the tactic. Instantly, win volume to create the illusion of growth. But underbidding in construction is the fastest path to disaster. When real costs exceed promises, something gets cut. And what gets cut is either quality or safety. Leonard said Ethan was digging his own grave. I knew he was right, but I also knew Ethan would try dragging me into it first. His next move was more calculated. Stephanie brought a set of construction documents into my office, sent by a subcontractor. A glance told me something was wrong. The footing depths and rebar specifications didn't match the design I'd given the client. I checked my emails. The design I sent was completely different. Someone had altered it before it reached the subcontractor. I called them immediately and asked who sent the revised files. They said someone from Sullivan Construction had emailed an updated version, claiming I'd requested the change. I knew instantly who'd done it. If the subcontractor built from the wrong design and the structure failed, state inspectors would come after Northwood Structural Solutions first. I sat down and breathed deeply. Ethan didn't just want to compete, he wanted to destroy me. But I'd survived one collapse. I wouldn't let another one take me down. I reported everything to the State Construction Inspection Office, sending both versions of the design for verification. At the same time, I ordered the subcontractor to halt all work until the documents were cleared. By reporting it myself, I protected the company and showed the subcontractor exactly how transparent we were. When inspectors confirmed the design had been tampered with and the sender wasn't me, they ordered Sullivan Construction to explain. I took no joy in seeing Ethan cornered, but I felt rare relief. This time, no one would pin the blame on me. A few weeks later, Northwood Structural Solutions received a call from a major investor in Grand Junction. They wanted us to bid on a new distribution center. At the first meeting, I learned they'd been watching my work for years. They said they wanted a team that prioritized safety over flashy timelines or profit shortcuts. I poured everything into the design and construction plan. Leonard handled the site survey, and Stephanie double-checked every calculation. When we presented to their board, they listened to every word. Nothing like the skeptical meetings I'd endured at Sullivan Construction. 2 weeks later, they announced Northwood Structural Solutions had won the bid. I didn't say it aloud, but when I opened the email, I felt like I'd reclaimed dignity stolen from me years before. I pictured Owen's smile when I told him his father's company would build its first major project. Meanwhile, things at Sullivan Construction only worsened. A project in Pueblo developed significant concrete cracking 4 days after pouring. Scaffolding at a Fort Collins site collapsed, injuring a worker. The technical team whispered that Ethan was making reckless decisions, and Leonard said the inexperienced crews could no longer control quality. Hearing it weighed on me. I didn't want Sullivan Construction to collapse, but I also knew I couldn't go back and save them. I'd chosen my path. Now I had to walk it. Standing on the empty lot in Grand Junction where Northwood Structural Solutions would build its first major project, I felt peace I hadn't experienced in years. Not because I'd defeated Ethan, but because I was building something with my own hands, without anyone diminishing my worth. And this was only the beginning. I never wished for Sullivan Construction to collapse, even after how deeply they'd hurt me. But when I heard the scaffolding at the Fort Collins site had partially fallen, injuring a worker, I knew the consequences of Ethan's recklessness had finally caught up. That incident was enough for the State Safety Division to launch a formal investigation. When inspectors arrived, they discovered the scaffolding crew lacked valid certifications, exactly as I'd warned months earlier. The media moved quickly. A Denver paper ran investigative reports showing Sullivan Construction had repeatedly hired underqualified, low-cost subcontractors. Former workers spoke publicly, saying safety protocols had been shortened for months. The news spread fast. Their major client in Pueblo announced a temporary shutdown of the entire project. I watched everything unfold quietly. Sullivan Construction had once been where I rebuilt my life, but now I only felt sorrow for the innocent people still trapped inside. Still, I knew this was the result of warnings ignored repeatedly. Good employees began leaving. Our office manager texted saying she couldn't stay in the chaos anymore. I immediately hired her at Northwood Structural Solutions. Leonard said he was getting calls from former engineers who no longer trusted Ethan. I accepted only those who genuinely wanted to build something new, not those simply running from the old. The person who weighed on me most was Henry Patterson, another longtime engineer. He'd supported me for years before choosing Ethan's promises. Now, Ethan was placing the entire Fort Collins incident on Henry, accusing him of poor supervision. Stephanie said Henry looked hollow, barely speaking to anyone. I wanted to call him, but I knew he was facing painful truth in his own way. One afternoon, while reviewing technical files for the Grand Junction project, my phone rang. Ethan. I almost didn't recognize his voice. No arrogance, no swagger, only panic. He said the company was about to lose its third contract in a month, that clients were demanding full audits and reporters were outside the office asking for statements. Then he said something that made me go silent. "Calvin, let's work together. Help me save the Sullivan name." I understood the desperation behind his words, but I also understood I no longer owed anything to a place that chose to cast me aside. I told him I couldn't save a company built on wrong decisions. Ethan tried saying more, but I wished him luck and ended the call. I thought that would be the end. But a few days later, Garrett appeared at my office. He walked in like someone who'd lost everything important. His hair showed more gray, his eyes more hollow. He sat across from me, but it took him a moment to speak. He said he was wrong. He admitted trusting Ethan blindly, ignoring my warnings, and letting the company slip to the edge. When he asked me to return and help save Sullivan Construction, I felt a sadness beyond words. I'd once respected him deeply, believed our trust was unbreakable, but he didn't stand with me when it mattered. He let Ethan tear me down in front of the whole company and stayed silent. I told him I'd tried to save Sullivan many times. Every chance to course correct had been thrown away by him and his son. Garrett lowered his head. In that moment, I saw a man realizing his legacy had been undone by the heir he'd chosen. I felt no satisfaction, only certainty that I couldn't go back. A week later, the news broke. Sullivan Construction had filed for bankruptcy. Employees scattered, sites shut down, clients moved on. Reporters asked for a statement. I said only, "No comment." Standing at my office window, I read the final article as Colorado afternoon light stretched across the land, where Northwood Structural Solutions was about to break ground on its largest project yet. An old chapter had closed, not with vindication, but quietly, like a foundation failing when cracks run too deep to repair. I wasn't happy. I wasn't sad. I was calm, because I finally understood not everything you lose is a loss. Some things are simply no longer yours to carry. 6 months later, Northwood was unrecognizable from its first day. We'd opened a second office in Colorado Springs and hired more engineers just to keep up. We weren't the biggest, but we'd become one of the most trusted, known for transparency and uncompromising safety. Clients who remembered my work now came straight to us, saying they wanted to build with a team they could rely on. Diane Porter stopped by occasionally, watching with a quiet smile. Once, she said, "You don't need to prove anything to anyone. Just keep doing what you've done since day one." Maybe she saw what I hadn't believed back then, that I could stand on my own. No company, no name, just my own integrity. Owen had grown so much. He loved telling classmates his dad had his own company. Every afternoon, he'd run out holding new drawings of buildings he wanted me to build someday. Some days he said he'd be an engineer like me. Other days, he just wanted to make sure I didn't overwork myself. If he was proud of his father, that was enough. Our little family settled into a peace I once thought impossible. I no longer woke up fearing my career could be destroyed overnight. No more asking permission to uphold safety. No more measuring myself against someone else's ambition. For the first time in years, I lived without bracing myself to prove my worth. Then came an email from the Colorado Engineering Association. They wanted me as keynote speaker at their Ethics and Safety Conference. I placed my hand on the desk and exhaled. 2 years earlier, I would have laughed at the idea. Now, it felt like confirmation I was on the right path. The hall was full. Engineers, contractors, investors. I spoke about transparency, about never trading safety for speed, about rising from failures that weren't mine but changed my course forever. When I finished, the room rose in applause. I didn't feel celebrated, just relieved to have spoken the words I needed to hear on the day everything collapsed. As I stepped off stage, I saw him near the back, Garrett Sullivan. Old suit, thinner frame, heavier posture. He didn't approach, just stood there, eyes sad, no longer defensive, finally facing the truth he'd avoided. For so long, he wasn't there for forgiveness. He was there to acknowledge that everything I'd said was what Sullivan Construction had lost. I bowed my head slightly. He gave a faint nod in return. No apology, no tears. Just two men understanding some things break beyond repair. I no longer held anger toward him, but I no longer belonged to that part of my life. That afternoon, I visited our new medical research facility on Denver's outskirts, a project I loved because it felt like building a future for someone else. On the 8th floor terrace, wind swept strong, and the sky burned autumn orange. Below, workers talked. Beneath my feet, the concrete deck hummed with steady life. In that moment, clarity struck. I'd lost trust, stability, a career I thought would last a lifetime. But without those losses, I never would have dared rebuild my life from the ground up. The strongest foundation isn't a company, a reputation, or others' approval. It's yourself and the small, and the aura family waiting for you every evening. I stood there until the last light slipped behind the Rockies, feeling lighter than I had in over a decade, as if I'd finally set down a weight I was never meant to carry alone. I had lost everything. And because of that, I built a new foundation, stronger, steadier, completely mine, and this time, no one would ever break it.